This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today, we welcome New York Times bestselling author Dr. Lisa Miller, a professor in the clinical psychology program at Teachers College, Columbia University. Dr. Miller speaks and consults around her books, The Awakened Brain and The Spiritual Child, for the U.S. military, businesses, personal development, faith-based organizations, schools and universities, and for mental health and wellness initiatives.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. Welcome to another edition of the Vickers Crossing podcast. The Vickers Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square, and we're glad to touch base with you again this week. My name is Rob Henderson, and I serve as the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London.
Finer Anglican you can't find in that, Rob Henderson, I got to say. But if you were looking for a close second, I'd put myself nearby anyway. My name is Kevin George, and I am the priest at St. Aidan's Anglican Church in the northwest of London.
And speaking of good Anglicans, here comes another one.
Yeah. Speaking of good Anglicans, here comes.
My name is Ian. I am a producer and the person who edits this podcast and sends this out into the ether of the internet. I hope you're having a good day.
All right, it's good.
So you get this to our ears.
Yeah, I get this to your ears.
Okay.
Yeah. And your eyes as well. Not your nose or
true.
your
true too.
mouth.
Yeah.
We don't have smell-o-vision yet.
Yeah.
I
don't
have
know if I would want smell-o-vision.
I wouldn't want that. Not today, guys.
No.
I just came back from a really long walk. And I'm like, ooh. But no, we're glad to be back again for another episode of our sixth season of the Vickers Crossing. And today we will be chatting with a wonderful guest. Dr. Lisa Miller is going to be here in a few minutes. And Dr. Miller has a new book out called The Awakened Brain, The New Science of Spirituality and Our Quest for an Inspired Life. And Dr. Miller is the New York Times bestselling author, also about a book called Spiritual Child. And she is a professor in the clinical psychology program and Teachers College at Columbia University. And her innovative research has been published in more than 100 peer-reviewed articles in leading journals. She is a sought-after consultant, sharing her wisdom with the likes of the U.S. military, tech and finance sectors, and faith-based organizations in many schools and universities. So looking forward to chatting with Dr. Miller today.
Amazing. She's been on everything. I've seen her on the NBC and the ABC and the CBS and the TV and all the other initials.
All the other acronyms, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess what we really should do then is do a land acknowledgement, yeah? Let's do a land acknowledgement.
What we're going to do, yeah.
Okay, so we want to acknowledge that the land upon which we record this podcast are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Attawandaron peoples. They are connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, Métis, Inuit, First Nations, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and people with whom we wish to walk the journey towards reconciliation.
Mm-hmm. We have three incredible sponsors that support our podcast, and we want to thank them today as well. First, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Many thanks to Dave Mullen for his great support. And Dave, a little gift coming to your office over the next week or so from myself and my family after we had a little night out at the Knights game.
Oh, yes, right.
Dave recently.
Did
So
they
that
win?
was good. They did win, and we watched live that incredible goal that was getting play all over TSN
Yes.
and all over the country.
Is that Evangelista, was it?
No, it was the other young forward from Michigan.
Yes.
Tony, I can't remember his last name, but he
Yeah.
did an end-to-end run from the back of the net through the entire Saginaw team, flipped one over into the corner to score, and we got to see that live. So that was pretty cool. So anyway, Dave, thanks, buddy. Appreciate that night.
All right. Well, that sounds like a good time, Rob. Well, this shout out goes to Carol Basada at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. I don't know if you have hockey tickets, Carol, but now would be the time to whip them out of your pocket.
That's right.
Carol is over at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. Get yourself over there. You cannot be better looked after than you will be right there. We've had to go through some things lately, Catherine Ann and I, and we're just overwhelmed at the care we receive when we go in there. But more than that, the fact that she will call or text after we've had something wrong to see how we're doing, you're not getting that from most of your pharmacists. So check in over there.
They're great over there. They're
Mhm.
awesome. But last, but certainly not least,
No,
we
not
have
at all.
Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And Trisha Lister was the human being who was wonderful over there who hooked us up with that. So many thank you to them over there at Molly Maid.
Okay, question, Ian.
Answer.
This is confirm or deny.
Okay.
Molly
yes or no
Maid,
questions.
yeah, Molly Maid inspected your room
Yeah.
and said that your previous chair was so filthy that you needed a new one.
I
Is
don't
this
know.
true or false?
Where did this idea come that my room is constantly a mess and covered in dirt and grime and slime?
I just want to know. You have a new chair, and you just talked about Molly Maid, and so I wondered. It's just connecting A and B to me.
I've had a new chair for a long time, Kevin.
I didn't notice.
Well, that's because the other one was so dirty you couldn't tell.
I just
Of
couldn't
course,
see it
right?
was
So
yeah.
covered. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So this is for ergonomic reasons and not cleanliness.
I'll leave that up to the imagination, just for you, Kevin.
Okay, all right.
All right. Dr. Lisa Miller is going to be joining us here. So I think she's knocking on the door. Should we invite her in, guys?
We should actually. And there's a good question coming up about somebody knocking on her door in this. So that'll be an interesting little segue there. Let's let her in.
And Dr. Miller joins us now here on the Vickers Crossing podcast. Dr. Miller, we want to welcome you. Thank you for being here today. And how are you?
It's great to be here, and I'm thrilled to jump in together. Thank you so much for this great invitation.
Yeah, we're connecting London, Ontario with, where are you? You in Connecticut or New York? Where are you hanging out?
At the moment, I'm down in Miami, so it's even a nice, bigger embrace yet.
Yeah,
good.
We were just talking about Florida before we came on. Rob was saying that he had a parishioner come back from there and he didn't recognize the same planet. Hey, Rob?
Yeah. Well, he was saying to me that he came back and he was talking to all these people that told him that that there was no COVID ever in Florida. And so we were having this conversation and he was saying, I can't believe these people, they were telling me this, that they didn't think it was there. And anyway, he was kind of funny when he was explaining it all. But anyway.
Different strokes for different folks. So in Canada, we're pretty awakened to the fact that COVID is real. But today we're here to talk about the awakened brain. And if there's ever three fellas that need their brains awakened, it's these three lads you're looking at on the screen here. But this book, which I have here, is, folks, if you pick it up on the YouTube, people will see it, but it's called The Awakened Brain, The New Science of Spirituality and Our Quest for an Inspired Life. I can't recommend it enough, and you won't put it down when you start reading it, particularly those of you, I think, who have known these things inside yourself for a long time. And to read Dr. Miller's research and work that sort of verifies in science something that many of us have known is really heartening. You tell the story in this book of how you discovered the awakened brain, why it matters, and how we can cultivate it in daily life. It is, as you have aptly described, a story of human possibilities, of the ways we are cut down and cut off, and how we might be made whole again, is what you say. In the introduction of the book, you lay out the stark reality of the unprecedented, really, mental health anguish that our culture is living with: depression, Anxiety, substance abuse have reached epidemic proportions. Among other startling statistics, we have, you write that 31% of American adults will develop full-blown anxiety disorder at some point in their lives, 19% in any given year. The World Health Organization reports that 264 million people on the planet at this moment are depressed. The third most costly disability worldwide. In fact, among clergy, we heard at our own clergy conference a couple of years ago that the reason our health and disability plan, while the costs are so high, is because of the cost of medications for clergy who are depressed. So these are very real and prescient issues. You write in the book about, you set up in the introduction about how you are describing a lab meeting to which you're going, and you're anxious to see the results of months and months of research using MRI. And you receive the report in hand and you scan it immediately and look up to the top half of the first page with the black rectangles with two brain images inside. The scan on the left shows the composite of a brain image of participants with low spirituality, and a composite on the right shows the brain of participants with sustained high spirituality. And the difference between the two images made your heart race and your spine tingle, is the way you described it. So tell us, what did you see and why was it groundbreaking?
The spiritual use of our brain makes a far hardier, stronger, really more flourishing brain. What we saw in those MRI scans, that people with a sustained spiritual life who over 8 years, when we checked in with them originally and again at 8 years later, said, yes, my personal spirituality is highly important to me. When I have a tough decision to make, I don't believe I ask, what does God want me to do? They are in a transcendent relationship with their higher power. Those people, day in and day out, start seeing life into its deeper, truer, sacred bedrock. And sure enough, their brains are more perceptive, more reflective, and more given to a deep orientation. They have built the cortex. They have a stronger, thicker cortex in the regions of the parietal, precuneus, and occipital. That was a landmark discovery. And it wasn't just because we found it, it's because we bared witness to what I would say is God's creation, right? There are moments in science where we are nothing but awestruck by the way the world is made and by the way we humans are made. And it was one of those moments where, beyond a shadow of a doubt, it was clear that our whole realized nature is as spiritual beings.
And as you describe it, I mean, like I found your painting of the scene with your research assistants and so on, passing around papers and shaking hands. Like, I mean, there must have been like you've piled your life into this. There must have been a great sense of anticipation.
So for over 10 years, we had found the same powerful finding through the lens of epidemiology, through the lens of long-term clinical course studies, which is a strong personal spirituality protects us about 2/3 against major depression. I mean, there's nothing in the clinical or social sciences as profoundly beneficial as a strong spirituality in coming through depression and preventing against depression. But when we shared that with the scientific community, because it was so unfamiliar, these are good folks, these are smart folks, but they just didn't know what to make of that finding. So they said, well, it must be there's some hidden third variable, that really these are like the good guys in life, where they have more social support. And we'd run out, we'd control for those possibilities. And sure enough, loud and clear, the signal was strong. Spiritual people recover from depression with a deepening. Spiritually oriented people augment our awareness through suffering. This is just a fact. But it wasn't until we had brain scans that the medical community truly embraced this. It was published in JAMA Psychiatry, which is a leading journal in psychiatry, that says, yes, this is real. This is the field. This is us. And it took brain scans, because we're at this point in our culture where in the 20th century, there was radical materialism. It's real if you can touch it. It's real if you can see it with your eyes. And if it's not, oh, well, that's just not so sure. We need science to make anything sure. And people in the 20th century, and still to this day, say, I am a deeply scientific person. I don't believe in that spiritual woo-woo stuff. Or they'd say, I'm a person of deep faith. I don't need the science.
Right.
But it turns out that spirituality and science can go hand in hand,
That's
and
right.
that science is a lens, right? We
Right.
can point it at a great host of questions, including the impact and nature of spirituality in the lived human life.
Yeah, it's sort of like I look at it and think about it in terms of even like postmodernism and, you know, this sort of need for us to have some quantifiable stuff. But there are mystery is such a big part of who we are, how we live, and how we express ourselves that, you know, and we'll talk more about integration later on. I was really taken by your description of the clinical environment that you came into when you started your work and your life's vocation. You've been at this a long time, despite your youthful appearance. You've been at
Graciously
this
put, graciously put.
a while. So you talk about 1994 comparing and compared to the groundbreaking sort of research that you're seeing now and what you saw then. The difference is just so startling. I couldn't help but notice, though, as I read, just how mindful you were even at a young age in your field. Like I one of the things I took away was, you know, you were perceptive enough to notice these things, right? It took somebody, I mean, somebody has to decide to do this research because they notice. You talk about awakening or being mindful. Whether it was the mindfulness around, you know, the reality of that unit 6 that you describe, which was sort of stark and cold, and the way people responded to, you know, heartfelt concern that they pour out, or your mindfulness sitting on a subway train, you know, of dysthemia, or is that how you say that? I'm not saying that right. Dysthemia.
Sure, dysthymia. Sure.
Dysthymia, which is, for those listening, a low-grade feeling that life is unfulfilled. Think about yourself sitting on a subway train in Toronto here for Canadians, or in New York, and all this sort of stuff that you see, and it's like, you know, what's the point of life? Perhaps most striking to me was the observation and mindfulness that caused you to ask critically important questions after an observance of Yom Kippur in the kitchen at Unit 6. I wonder if you can share that experience with our listeners and what you observed and how it left you asking the question about what really happened that day, and a little bit about the response that you got from your clinical supervisor.
Thank you. But first of all, thank you for your gracious words. And I'll share with you that the visibility of the suffering was so profound on what I call Unit 6. And I call it Unit 6 because it was in keeping with what the norms of the time. Very caring, well-intentioned people, like psychotherapists, psychiatrists. The models we had just weren't working. You know, in those days, instead of digitizing, we had manila folders. And each time, you know, someone would basically be a little bit better with medication, their symptoms would recede a little bit, they were let out of the hospital. And sure enough, within 2 or 3 months, we'd see them back. And admission after admission, these files would get thicker and thicker. And there were some files that were so thick when they reached 8 inches, a second file would be started, the revolving door. The patients of deepest suffering were not getting better with the models we had at the time. And so I listened to the patients, and the patients would say things. For instance, one woman who had been in over 10 times to our inpatient unit was being sent away, which is really the closest thing to a death sentence. Your body lives on, but your life is foreclosed. And she was being sent away upstate, where she would very likely spend the rest of her days, a state institution very far away. Dr. Miller, tomorrow I'm being sent upstate. Could you come with me, please? And she took me by the arm and she walked me down the hall, into the kitchen, into the pantry, to the way back corner, and standing by pots and pans where she felt safe to say these words. Dr. Miller, will you pray with me? That was a living testimony to what was missing from the healing environment. She had solved the puzzle. Everything else we'd given her had failed. And her lifeline was her relationship to her higher power, to who she called God, who I call God, one God, many names, whether you say, you know, universe, God, Hashem, Allah, Jesus, but we know who we're talking about. And that relationship is what was going to see her through her darkest hour. So, you know, I was hearing this time and time again. And once the patients in their most painful moment, these real crucibles of suffering, knew you were listening, they told you what they wanted you to know. And this went on. A number of patients pulled me aside, and always in secret, as if it were somehow taboo. They picked up on the culture of the so-called mental
Right.
health field.
Yeah.
So we rolled around. It was fall. This is in an area of New York, just to keep the hospital
Yes.
anonymous. And
Sure.
there was a great number of Jewish people on this inpatient unit. And sitting in community meeting the week before, one man who had bipolar, he was very agitated. He would have outbursts and then become deeply quiet and recede, and outbursts, major bipolar, very agitated, very frustrated, very not at home in his skin. Jewish man raised his hand and he said, "Doctors, what will be the program for Yom Kippur?" Yom Kippur, of course, is the holiest day of the year for Jews. It's the day of forgiveness and of renewal.
Yeah.
Yes. So when he heard no, nothing's planned, he became deeply, deeply receded, and then an outburst. What? Nothing? Nothing at all for Yom Kippur? And I looked across the room, and a woman with profound depression, suddenly also a Jew, receded deep into her chair. And I realized these patients felt taken from. There was something terribly wrong in their healing journey to not have the Day of Atonement observed. And so, being a Jew, although not a rabbi, I pulled aside the unit chief and I said, I am not a rabbi, but I'd be glad to facilitate the Yom Kippur service. And given permission, I came in the day of Yom Kippur. And whereas normally folks acted in very expressive and florid ways and were wearing these scanty robes that were really quite humiliating, I walked into our kitchen where we were to have our ceremony, and everyone had come in their finest clothes. Many had had relatives drop off clothes, and they sat with a look that something special was about to happen. And they looked whole, and they looked like all the folks I knew back home in my synagogue. No one looked florid, no one looked extreme, they looked at peace. And as we started to share the prayers that all of us had heard all of our lives, every Jew around the world has heard the same prayers, the gentleman who was the most explosive actually hit the rhythm of the prayer with the greatest ease and rhythmicity and led us through the prayers. And the woman who had receded, as we went around the table to talk about Yom Kippur, showed great interest. When it got to me, I said, well, speaking for myself, I like Yom Kippur. I like Yom Kippur because I mess up in life. I make mistakes. And on Yom Kippur, I can ask for forgiveness. Well, we get around the table, and the woman who had felt such shame and such sense of unworthiness sat up proudly and said, I had always known on Yom Kippur we could ask forgiveness. But sitting here with you today, bright, shining, smiling, leaning forward, she said, I realize that God can actually forgive us. Day later, I'm sitting in my office, same woman knocks on my door. Dr. Miller, I just wanted you to know I appreciated your sharing that you could ask for forgiveness. And I just wanted you to know that God can forgive you.
Wow.
So yes, they were illuminated, and in a way that was diametrically opposite to their struggle, in a way that was the complete opposite of their diagnosis. The bipolar gentleman intact, the guilty receded woman worthy and illuminated. And I saw spirit shine through and radically outshine the limitations of the ego, the habits of our being.
And then you took that to your clinical supervisor.
Yes. Well, so I took a number of things to my clinical supervisor. She didn't quite know what she signed on for.
I feel like you did.
At least I was honest. And
that's right.
And she said, almost every time what you did was beautiful, but don't ever repeat that. Meaning don't tell anybody, don't tell anyone at all. So the patients were right. You got to pull me into the pots and pans room to tell me that you want to pray.
Yeah. Amazing story. In one of the chapters, I want to ask you about this. One of the chapters of the book, you ask a very important question, which is it possible that the same piece of our genetic wiring carries both, carries the risk of depression and the capacity to be spiritually aware? Is it possible that depression and spirituality might really be opposites or sides or the same side of the same coin? Might they even share a common physiology? Could what we call depression at times actually be spiritual hunger? That really struck me. a normally and genetically derived part of human development that is unhealthy to deny. In the chapter, you write about the work of Dr. Kendler, and his research pointed to the fact that low levels of depressive symptoms are related to high levels of personal devotion. And secondly, that personal devotion can serve as a buffer against the negative psychological effects of stressful life events. And thirdly, personal devotion decreased the lifetime risk for alcoholism and nicotine dependence, in that spiritual people are less likely to be addicted people. And he also found that there was a significant genetic contribution to spirituality. And so using Dr. Kendler's newly established variables of personal devotion as partially hardwired and personal conservatism, you investigated the developmental antecedent to what he had found among adults, putting the lens of science up to the spiritual growth formation in teens. I was wondering if you can say more about this genetic disposition and what your own research discovered, and this theory that depression and spirituality might really be opposite sides of the same coin, because that really is fascinating.
Thank you. That is perhaps the most groundbreaking finding within science, that in 1997, Ken Kendler, a genetic epidemiologist, published a twin study, which for the first time established that we are innately, naturally spiritual beings. What Ken Kendler found when he looked at twins raised together, twins raised apart, and factored out their degree of commonality as a function of genes and environment, was that every single one of us is born with an innate capacity for spiritual awareness. It is 1/3 innate. It is in us, it exists. And yet it is 2/3 environmentally socialized, meaning that although every one of us is born a naturally spiritual being, our pastor, priest, imam, rabbi, our parents, our 10,000 exchanges by the school locker, all weigh in to embrace that natural propensity and cultivate or lay atrophy the spiritual core. The most important thing we can do as parents, as clergy, as teachers, as anyone who cares about young people, is to foster a relationally spiritual environment, to live out spiritual values, to speak openly about our own transcendent experience, our own deep personal relationship to God. When the whole world around a young person gives voice and name and calls attention to the spiritual reality, then that natural capacity for awareness inside every child gains form. In the same, day in and day out with a young child, orange apple, tow truck, yellow school bus, right? Yeah. Well, we need to lay name to the knowing, the natural innate awareness of the child. The child's born a knower. We are not a blank slate. Now, where this really becomes important is that scientists had sat around for a good deal of time trying to define spirituality. Now, that is something that has been pursued for thousands of years, trying to define spirituality. And with Kendler's study, it became abundantly clear that we don't know how to define spirituality, but we do have the skills and tools to identify threads of lived human spiritual life that are enormously impactful on the rest of our lives. And we do have the tools to know the extent to which a thread within lived human spiritual life is our birthright, or is environmentally formed, or is a combination of both. So that was a major breakthrough what Kendler gave us. What's particularly interesting is that the two dimensions of lived spiritual life that have proven in the next 25 years to be profoundly tidal wave changing for our lives are, first and foremost, the transcendent relationship. I turn to God for guidance in times of difficulty. When I have a tough decision to make, I ask, what really does God want me to do? It is a dynamic, lived, transcendent relationship. And the second very powerful dimension is that might be shared in fellowship, in the Sangha, in the Minyan, in the journey group. And when those two pieces of lived spiritual life are present, a teen is 80% less likely to become addicted to drugs and alcohol. Addicted using DSM criteria. If you told me as a parent of now 3 teens, give your teen this little pill and they're 4/5 less likely to ever become an addict, I would sleep out on the wet sidewalk for that, right?
Yes, there you go.
I'm sure you know, and your community knows, the epidemic of our time, tragically,
Yeah.
is that the rate of death by suicide has surpassed the rate of death by auto accidents in
It's
high
wild.
school.
Wow. Wow.
So, when I was 15, I didn't know anyone who had attempted suicide. All three of my teenage children have talked someone off the edge.
Wow.
It is in the
Wow.
culture of young adults.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's a 50 to 80% decreased relative risk of completed suicide
Yeah.
when a strong personal
It's
spirituality is shared.
It's a shared experience.
Shared.
Yeah. Which is something we always talk about in church circles and faith formation circles, that community and being together in community is so important. And what COVID did over the last couple of years, taking us away from that ability to be in community and have that shared experience. Some of the effects of that we're seeing in rates of, and we've heard about it, rates of depression getting higher and these types of things, right? So you can see that those two things sinking, definitely. And that's been our experience.
Yes, and they indeed go hand in hand. In fact, the very same neurodocking station, the same circuits in the brain through which we are in relationship to God, allow us to see God in one another. And again, whether your name is Spirit or Jesus or Hashem. So it is a transcendent relationship that we have with our higher power that exists in love of neighbor and altruism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Please.
No, I was just going to say, I don't know how you felt, Rob, but when you were just saying, Dr. Miller, that, as parents, as friends, as priests, as clergy, as imams, as rabbis, or that, there is a point to modeling, to showing, to telling, to trying to live in such a way as to show another human being that there is a purpose, and that, love does matter, and that there is a reason for being. And I don't know about you, Rob, but I sort of felt I got a little leap inside for a second, because I thought there are days I feel, I'm not sure it's worth it.
Well,
You know what I mean?
I was thinking that a couple of times. This is extremely hopeful in a lot of ways for clergy. And, I don't want to speak for all clergy, but like Kevin said, there are days you wonder, I've done all this work and you don't see anything in it often, because it's we don't work in a situation where
quantifiable.
Quantifiable in a sense when you've done some of the things you've done over the course of the week. But to hear this, as Dr. Miller's explaining,
Dr. Miller tells us it is quantifiable.
Well, there you go. Yeah, who knew?
And in fact, then let me share that of all the dimensions of lived spiritual practice, prayer and good works, and of all of the things that we do that live and hold spiritual life, it is actually what you've just described, walking the walk,
right,
living out the word, that has the greatest impact on the strengthening of the awakened brain.
Yeah, that's incredible.
The spiritual brain is made strong, like thick trees.
Yeah.
The cortex is strong when we are in relationship with the type of love of neighbor, the type of ultimate care, and looking at everyone who walks in the door as a soul on earth, as you do. Right? It doesn't matter if I just won the lottery or was arrested and sentenced to 10 years. I walk in and you look at me with love.
Exactly.
That is deep, sacred love. You are an ambassador of the higher power.
You've come up against a lot doing this research over the years. You've come up against, I would say, more than one obstacle, as you've described it in the book. After completing your research, you were aware that and became aware of the Kenneth Kendler study and your own epidemiological research and clinical work. They were largely invisible in your field, that you were aware of that, and you were given the opportunity to present this research at Columbia. And you took the stage with great excitement. You describe it as almost as if you floated up there, because it was finally you were going to get to tell this to the world, which happened by some sort of, miracle in its own right, because somebody gave their spot to you, right? And you take the stage and you give your talk, and then something happens, and you leave less enthused. And then you get called to Dr. Schaefer's office, and he happens to be like the head of the department or something, right? And you're wondering, oh no, now I've given this talk and I've got to go to his office. What is going to happen? You're meeting with the chair of the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Department. Oh dear, because of the response you got. I just wonder if you can share what that response was to your presentation, and then the flip side, if I don't spoil the surprise, of what you got when you got in that office.
Thank you. Yes. So I was a postdoc at Columbia Medical School in New York, and I was thrilled that I was going to be able to share these profoundly, I felt it was a form of bearing witness. It was like standing up and sharing right from the heart, but told through the language of science. That here, looking at the data sets that my colleagues at Columbia and across the country believed in, nationally representative data sets, and here using the measures that they used in their own studies of depression, of social functioning, but for one variable, the new variable of personal spirituality, that they would recognize the extraordinary impact. There is nothing that had been found in the clinical or social sciences as profoundly curative and as profoundly protective against depression and addiction. So I put the findings up there. A teen is 80% less likely to become addicted if he or she has a strong spirituality. And I looked at my colleagues like, what a miracle this is. Look at God's creation. Look at what a miracle this is. And what a possibility as an inroad for healing and renewal. And everyone looked a little taken aback. A few looked annoyed, puzzled, right?
Puzzled,
now,
pondering,
these are pondering. And these are very nice people who've given their whole lives to this line of work, and they looked a little bit taken aback. We'll leave it at that. And someone shot up her hand, someone who I admired, maybe 20 years my senior, and said, well, I'm just trying to figure out what these findings really mean. And I said, oh, well, it means that if you have a personal spirituality, you are 4/5 less likely to become addicted as a teenager. She's like, yeah, but don't you think it's just social functioning? And I said, well, actually, we controlled for social functioning, that spiritual young people are actually more socially at ease and good to one another, but that doesn't explain why it is that they're not addicts. And we went through one variable after the next. And then I noticed some folks get up in the back, walk out the door, and really without a moment's, notice or apology, the door slammed shut.
I'll tell you, when they walk out on your sermon, you know that you've hit the right nerve.
That's right.
I just got to tell you, you're doing it right, Dr. Miller. Keep going.
Well, thank you, because that is how I took the rejection, that it was a sign that this work was worth doing, that no one understood what it meant. It didn't land in a very good Department of Psychiatry. It didn't have a home. And so it was only going to be through the language of science and then translation of these findings to healing modalities, to partnerships between the clergy and behavioral health, to all the different ways that we can support the spiritual core of the child, particularly one slated, for instance, the child of an addict. How can we keep them from falling down that very high risk tunnel? Well, it's by intervening as a spiritual community. It's through igniting and supporting that child's innate capacity for spiritual awareness. The implications are absolutely societal changing. And you've known this all along. All we have here is a mirror from science to say, yes, we suffer as a society because we have a huge donut-sized hole in the middle of our heart. Right. And it is only through a relationship with our higher power that, as we are designed to be, that we are made whole to fully flourish.
Augustine talked about it as, our souls are alone until they find their rest in God, and talked about a God-shaped hole that we have that we try to fill with everything else that doesn't fit. And until we fill it with what we know it's supposed to be filled with, we're disconnected.
Designed to be filled with.
If you look at now, we have hundreds of studies 25 years later, and it is incontrovertible. If you look at this constellation of hundreds of peer-reviewed science to be published, 2 or 3 scientists blind review each piece 2 or 3 times. This is the best science can do, fact. And if we look at this constellation, it is incontrovertible that we are inherently spiritual beings. We flourish and thrive and are healthy and connected when we realize our natural spiritual core. It is the hub of the wheel of the rest of our being. And we are designed to only flourish when we are in deep relationship to God, whatever one's word may be. That is simply how we are made. And the problem right now, the reason we have never faced such epidemic levels of addiction and depression and suicide is because in the public square 40 years ago, in the good effort to be inclusive, we threw out religion and the spiritual baby with the bathwater. And we now have a spiritually inconversant North America.
Right.
There is no space in the public square to comfortably have a discussion around spiritual life. And for its silence, wherever there's silence, there's some sort of injustice or eradication. And there's a silencing of our natural spiritual core to the point where the next generation, who are now Gen Z, do not, many of them, some do, but many of them do not know how to connect to God. They don't have a language. They were never shared in the family, any form of prayer, meditation. Morals are cherry picked. They're not derived from an ultimate relationship to reality. Well, these suffering young adults are bearing the cost of our silencing our culture. We can bring spirituality back into the center by being inclusive, spiritually multilingual, in the way that we've tried so hard to be inclusive about race and everything else, and then gender and orientation. We can be inclusive around spiritual life.
Yeah. Wow. You write about synchronicity in the book, and you do so by sharing an important part of your own journey. You write about the relationship between biology and spirituality that played out in your life. And you share quite openly with those that will read the book about yourself and your husband, Phil's struggle to become parents. I'm wondering if you could take a moment and maybe share some of that story with our listeners about, how your inner life and outer life lined up in a way that felt quite significant and too improbable to have happened by chance when you had a rather strange visitor knock at your door. That was kind of a fascinating story too.
Yes. So Phil and I were about 30, and we had known each other since I was 19 and he was 20. And we married in our early 20s, and we really wanted, thinking, well, we have the jobs we want and we're living the way we want. And we thought now we would like to be parents, on demand. And there we went off to the Caribbean on a little vacation, came back, and there was no baby. And we kept, even the word itself, trying to be parents, right? And nobody came. And after a few months, I thought, well, let's both get ourselves checked out medically. We were fine, but still nobody came. And I started to feel a little bit anxious. It never had dawned on me we wouldn't conceive. So we went to see the first of what became a long line of fertility doctors. And when, after a few low-grade procedures, nothing happened, we upped the ante. We ended up at IVF, and still nobody came. So we thought, well, being a scientist, I'm going to research the clinic that has the highest rates of conception. We're going to fix this problem. We're going to strategize. And using what I've come to call an achieving lens, let's work this out and win the day and strategize tactically. And we went, of course, to the doctor with the highest rates, and nobody came, and did a couple rounds of IVF, and nobody came. I thought, well, I'm a scientist, and doctors, maybe we need to go to the scientist who invented IVF. So we identified the scientist who, using sea urchins at Woods Hole and outside of Boston, invented IVF. And still nobody came. But this time, sitting there in the office, having made this long medical trip, I acknowledged in my heart that while this might be the path for some, I was in the wrong office. It felt wrong in the deepest part of my inner knowing. I felt like I was chasing the wrong ball. And there we were, on bed rest, Phil, my husband, and I, and thinking, why is it I'm not getting pregnant? Well, maybe this one will hold. We'd now gone to a doctor who was so good at this that he'd actually been brought special for several months to the Middle East on a special assignment some years ago to conceive an heir. So this guy had it.
Can't get better than that.
Can't get better than that. We need an heir. That's what we need. And there we were. And believe it or not, in this comfortable hotel, I clicked the remote on our TV, Phil by my side in solidarity on bed rest. And there was only one channel. I couldn't believe it. I'm like, what are we paying tonight? Wouldn't turn. I pushed and it wouldn't turn. And what we were forced to watch was a heartbreaking documentary of a young boy, an orphan, living in a garbage dump in Central America. And through the translator, this young boy said, I don't care that I can't go to school. I don't care that I live in a garbage dump, but it hurts so much to not be loved. to this day, I sniff glue to make the pain go away. And I thought, what type of egotistical, solipsistic rut have we been in? This has been a wild goose chase. I could have been a mother. He could have had a mother 2 years ago, but he's been in pain for not being loved. And I've been in pain for not having a boy or girl to love. And it really hit Phil first. He looked at me and he said, there's a child out there for us. So what is life showing me now? What is God saying? That all of these doors were closed, far too unprobabilistically closed to have happened by chance. He was healthy. I was healthy. Best doctors in the world, and no conception. Too unprobabilistic to have happened by chance. There was a deeper reason. And once we got that picture, I started paying attention to the helpers and healers lining the road, and the messengers and the synchronicities. So, sitting down on the bus the day after the failed in vitro, the way back, the very back row of the bus is 3/4 empty, and a quite unusual gentleman gets on, and feeling a little depressed and feeling a little unsocial. I watched him sort of move towards the back of the bus. And I thought, oh no, not today. I don't have it. I don't have it in my repertoire today.
Yeah.
He sits down, literally touching side by side, the next seat, leans forward and says, miss, you look like just that type of woman to go all over the world adopting kids.
Yeah. Wow. Isn't that something?
Life is alive and God speaks through us, and we are being guided, and we are held, and we are loved, and we are never alone. And when I realized that no matter how painful each failed in vitro felt like a funeral. It felt like a little death, the death of that little embryo. And as I realized that in these very painful moments, there was always a synchronicity, the presence of God. There was always a helper, a healer. We actually were being loved and held. This whole process was held. We were not alone, and we were guided. And that is what sustained us through this journey, and actually was the awakening that pulled us through the depression. So much so that we then found our way through helpers and healers to a wonderful daughter of a clergyman whose life work it was to help families come together. And in particular, she found babies and young children in orphanages in Russia and through Eastern Europe, Ukraine. And she'd bring these little babies back, and families were formed. And when we went to see her, the walls were lined in photos of families that had come together through the miracle of adoption, that your spiritual child comes to you. And so she looked at me and she said, look around this wall. I'm a very practical woman on top of it all, right? She said this mystical family maker was very practical. What type of child would you like? Point to what type of child you would like. And I said, I don't care. I don't care if this is a boy or a girl. I don't care what race this child is, but please, a child who can love. This is our first child, a child who can love. And Phil looked at her and said, yes, all that. But then he leaned forward and said, but kind of a girl. He put in a little bit of an order.
Kinda, yeah.
And it was interesting because within the next couple of weeks, I got a call from, my name is Lisa Jane, and I have an older cousin whose name is Jane. She goes by Big Jane in our family. And Big Jane's always given me the scoop. When I was 14, she sent me a book about growing up, our bodies, ourselves. And she's always been the one to tell me what's really going on in the family. So Big Jane called and said, Miss Columbia professor, you think you're so smart, but instead of studying about spirituality and about indigenous traditions, why don't you come out here to a healing ceremony? And since it was Big Jane who asked, I got on a plane within a couple of days' notice. I canceled all my appointments at Columbia. I flew out to South Dakota and attended a healing ceremony, which culminated in sitting in the Innate, the sweat lodge, with a circle of women, men in one, Innate women in the other. And the woman who identified herself as the medicine man's wife led the ceremony. And she spoke of God, one God, many names, as Wananichi. And she said, Wananichi, I don't know who this woman is. And I realized, I looked out of place.
In your polka dot blouse.
Polka dot blouse. I looked like I was rushing for a plane from LaGuardia. Right? I'm sitting in the Innate. I don't know who this woman is, said she. But this rewrites the way we look at the so-called other. I don't know why she's come, but I know that she's come, that you have brought her, Wananichi. So please let me help her.
Wow.
So he or she put
incredible.
before us as sent by God. Please let me help her. And I'm sure you've seen that many times in the
Absolutely.
calling you live. And there we were, and we
Sure.
went around the circle, and each woman talked about why she'd come. And one said, my son is 40. He no longer comes home. I'm worried for the family. The next said, my son, he's only 14. He started to use drugs and I see him slipping away. And the next said, my son. And they went around the circle till Big Jane was up. And she said, I want to introduce my cousin. This is little Jane. And they all look. I'm wondering if we could help her. She's come looking for her child. And they all got it. And I realized for the first time I was in the right place. And I talk a lot as a teacher, professor, but I am sure you know, was glad to have someone speak for me that day.
Of course.
I was moved, tongue-tied.
Yeah.
And then we said our prayer, and the prayer was a prayer for us as a collective. So it was a prayer that every woman's prayer might be heard, and that us as a group, in some sense, had sent up a unitive prayer. And whoosh, in my mind's eye, I could see it go up. It was numinous. And that very night, after 5 years of IVFs and pain and tears, but also a deepening of awareness and a spiritual awakening that we all can have in our journey of great despair. To this day, I cry. A phone call came that night, that very night that I'd been in the Innate, and it came from Russia. And it came from the clergyman's daughter. And she said, this is a call for the Millers. We have found the Miller's child. There are many great girls, and we can bring you a girl if that's still what you want, Mr. Miller. But this is the Miller's child, and this is a son.
Wow.
So he is named Isaiah Lakota. Isaiah Lakota, for those who helped us in prayer find him.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you so much. That is incredibly powerful.
Thank you for connecting in this very meaningful way, very deep, meaningful way. Thank you.
All right, Ian, over to you, buddy.
Yeah, well, we have, hello, I've been here. We have a fantastic other segment because we have a lot of privilege asking you questions, but in this case, we have something called listener questions. Listener questions. And today's question for you comes from Dawn Davis from Huron University College, where she is Assistant Professor of Contextual Learning and Director of Leadership for Ministry Programs in the Faculty of Theology. And
that's
Dawn,
a lot, Ian.
That's massive. And Dawn was actually the person who brought us the attention to your book. And this is their question for you.
Hi there, Dawn Davis here at Huron University College. And hello, Dr. Lisa Miller. Thoroughly enjoyed your 2 books and hoping you continue to provide such great work on spiritual formation and science. My big question is, given all of the challenging circumstances we face today, the invasion of the Ukraine, the just coming out of COVID, and of course the looming existential crisis of climate change, how does the awakening brain help not just inoculate against anxiety, but help bring about a just, sustainable, and more peaceable world? Thanks.
What a gift, Dawn. Thank you for that question. What a gift. Thank you, Dawn. And thank you for sharing the awakened brain with our colleagues and friends, and now friends.
Yes.
We cannot get out of these problems with the same thinking that created these problems. We have narrowly used only half of our capacities by constantly applying strategy, tactics, what I call the achieving brain. You know, that what happens here has nothing to do with what happens on the so-called other side of the world. With the view that every problem has a solution if we push hard enough, and that, hey, if you have something, that means I don't, right? This is a world of dog eat dog competition in a very narrow, short-sighted way. It's a world of radical materialism. It's a world where your win is my loss. It's a set pie, a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
And to Don's point, we have within us, aside from achieving awareness, a whole nother side of perception, which is awakened awareness. Our natural brain, every one of us is endowed with the capacity for awakened awareness, through which, instead of thinking your gain is my loss, I realize there's a deeper sense in which we are one. There is a deeper unitive field of life. We are part of one family. And that's you and me and people in all sorts of zipped up bio bodysuits with all sorts of GPS coordinates, and it's fellow living beings, and it's air and water and earth. That we can realize in our awakened awareness that we are both a point, beautifully unique and living here and there, and we are part of a wave, one loving wave of consciousness, you might say spirit. And maybe we look different at moments because we're whitecaps from one ocean.
Right.
Well, when we really get it in our heart and soul that we are part of one family of life, we are never alone. And everything we do affects all of us. We also start to realize in this relationship with creation, with God, with spirit, that we are not like Mighty Mouse supposed to fix everything, that we are made to receive God's guidance and inspiration. Now, why do we wait to bottom out to say, I'm going to hand it over, or some tragic trauma to say, I need to lean on more, I can't carry it myself? We are built every day of our lives to be in deep partnership and dynamic relationship with our higher power. And that's where answers come. That's where, if we seem stuck and, do we make money and dump poison in the water or make less money, right? That is a false split. When you throw that to God, what comes is a total rearrangement of meaning, and it's no longer win-lose. That what is practical is also ethical, is also inspired. Right. So that catch in the catcher's mitt of guidance, of inspiration, is the way important decisions can be made. We are made for this. And I would say it is the only way that we are going to elevate ourselves up out of this way of thinking. And we won't even need to fix these problems because we won't have them.
Right.
We will live in a different form of deep love and relationship to one another and this magnificent gift of earth.
Yeah, it's this integration that you write about, right? So it's pulling all of it together.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Amazing.
And we need both. We need, awakened awareness shows us what's true. And it can be very high pixel information. It can come in an inspiration and a prayer. It can come on a walk in nature or in a dream or a mystical experience or a gut instinct.
Yes.
But it is high pixel information, and it may unfold over time, months, years, all that it means.
Yeah.
But it is the most powerful, truest form of information. And it's that knowing of the heart, the awakened heart, that can then guide the head for implementation and strategy and discernment. We have it backwards far too often. When I went to school, I learned to use my head to decide what was real, and then mobilize my sensibilities, which became about craving and competition. Right. But if the heart receives what's real, then discernment and implementation is of the head.
Yeah, right. Amazing.
Awesome.
Dr. Lisa Miller, the book is The Awakened Brain, the New Science of Spirituality and Our Quest for an Inspired Life. I think I've just found my next book study in my parish. So thank you very much. This has just been an absolute gift, Dr. Miller, this last hour, and we just scratched the surface. So we want to thank you for sharing with us today. Thank you for your work and giving us the time. And we really appreciate you being part of our Vickers Crossing podcast today. Thank you.
It's a tremendous joy to be with you, and please have me back. I found some new friends.
We'd love to. We would love to. Okay, take care. Dr. Lisa Miller here on the Vickers Crossing podcast, and a wonderful discussion. We highly recommend you pick up the book. And remember, all of our books and those that we chat with, their works are on our website, thevickerscrossing.com. You can check us out online to find links to those books and many other things about upcoming episodes. Or if there's an episode you really like that you want to hear again,
all there.
it's all there for you. It's all there.
Yeah.
Hey guys, that was great. Thanks again to our sponsors here in the Vickers Crossing, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Our friends at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. And our friends at Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's in London.
I'm Kevin George from St. Aidan's Church.
My name is Ian. Thank you for listening.
And remember, Kevin, and Ian too, I'll remind you because you're a good friend. Always look both ways.
Before you cross the street, you want to be awakened to the fact that there's cars on the road.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!